I'm thrilled to introduce Preeti Dhillon, a researcher and writer and author of the brilliant book. I have a proof copy. Preeti has a real copy. There you are. Of The Shoulders We Stand On, which are 10 moments in the anti-racist struggle where Black and South Asian people work together to fight for change. And I think if I'm right, this is the first time a book has been written about these moments. And I know when I was writing my Radio 4 series, £3 in My Pocket, about the social history of British South Asians, I really wanted a book like this. I looked for a book like this and I couldn't find it. So I'm so happy that finally 2023 it's been written. So Preeti, welcome.
Thank you, Lisa.
Maybe that was the impetus for your book. I don't know. Is that why you decided to write it?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the reasons. When I started learning about these movements, I could find snippets of information. They kept being referenced in different books or in different articles, but nowhere could I find the long story of actually what happened. It was either in kind of academic articles or in local history projects, and there was nothing in between kind of for the general public to access. I thought, well, these stories are incredible. They have to be told. And yeah, so I thought I would do that. But I thought I would focus on movements in particular, because there's a lot out there which focuses on individuals and hidden individuals from history. And a lot of those focus on women and Black and brown people, which is great and very necessary. But I think they can also skew us a bit in terms of thinking that it's only individuals that create change. And so I really wanted to focus on movements to show that it's collective action that has always really led to change, and to emphasize that again.
I mean, this is very much part of British history, but why is it that this history isn't known? Why is it that you're having to find fragments of it here and there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one I asked myself time and time again as I was researching it. And I've come to the conclusion that I think it's because to talk about anti-racism, we have to talk about racism. And that leads to a lot of uncomfortable conversations that people don't necessarily want to have, especially when it's such recent history. And so I think we're more comfortable talking about things like World War II or things that invoke kind of a civic pride, like abolishing slavery, as far as that is actually accurate as well, as opposed to having the conversations about the less inspiring sides of British history. I think it's the same reason we don't really talk about empire.
But your book is not only the collection of these stories, but you're focusing on the Black and the South Asian experience together. And some of the stories are individual, but often it's where they come together. And I find that often these are quite siloed. Why did you choose to bring them together in this way?
I don't think, I felt like I didn't really have a choice, because when researching this period, one thing that kept coming back was the solidarity between all the movements. So 2 members of the executive committee of the British Black Panthers were brown, Farooq Dondi and Mala Sen. And so there's a lot of solidarity between Black and brown people, as well as within communities as well, that we don't necessarily see today. People called themselves Black because Black was a political unifier. And so everyone was Black. Everyone who was oppressed and marginalized was Black. And they joined together in these movements. And I think the cover is a particularly good example of this. That's why I chose this photo, because you have Barbara Beese, who was a Black Panther, a huge activist. She was part of the Mangrove 9, which I talk about in the book as well. And she's there with her son, which I love, Darkest Beast. On the other side, unfortunately cut off, though, is Mala Sen, who was brown, holding the other hand of Darkest Beast. And they are supporting the Bengalis in the East End of London at a protest. And so it really shows the unity and the solidarity that was there at the time. And so when writing about this this era, I had to write about both the Black and brown experiences, because it was impossible to disconnect.
Before we get into the heart of your book, I think it's really important to say that until 1965, there was a colour bar, wasn't there? And I think it's something that people don't think about in Britain. They think about it being somewhere else, like America, but it did kind of exist, didn't it? You could discriminate against people on a racial basis. That wasn't against the law.
Yes, until 1965. I mean, my parents were born in the early 60s. I'm not sure they'll appreciate me aging them there, but they were born in the early 60s. So when they were born, it was still legal to racially discriminate in the UK. The first Race Relations Act was only in 1965, as you mentioned, and there was another one in 1968 and a few after that. So the colour bar meant that it was legal for companies not to hire Black and brown people. And I discussed this when I discussed the Bristol bus boycott from 1963, because they were boycotting the Bristol Omnibus Company, who decided not to hire Black and brown people as drivers and conductors on the buses. And the colour bar also existed in all areas of life. It was really hard to find housing. This was the era of signs saying no Blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And so it was perfectly fine for people not to rent their accommodation to you. This also happened in pubs, that Black and brown people wouldn't be served in pubs or weren't allowed in pubs. And this was also challenged a lot by organizations at the time. And it just didn't go away after 1965. 1965 also crucially didn't include areas like employment. So it was still actually legal to discriminate in employment until 1968. But it was a first step in acknowledging that racism actually existed in the UK.
And it's quite important I think, to understand that, because then so much of the subsequent movements that you then talk about, that is the basis of it, and that is the kind of atmosphere in Britain at the time that they were fighting against. But it's also important to say, and again, I think this is not widely understood, that there was a Black and South Asian experience that predated the post-war years. It wasn't big, but it existed, in fact, for hundreds of years, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's evidence of Black people in the UK from even the Roman times, and brown people have been in the UK as long as Britain has also been in the Indian subcontinent, which has, as we know, has been hundreds of years. A lot of, for example, the Bengalis in East London, they came over as Lascars, as seamen. They were working on the ships. And then they ended up in East London. They were often abandoned by the East India Company and others who had hired them. And they set up home there. Other women came over, for example, as ayahs, as nannies, to take care of children. And again, they were often also abandoned, given no way to go home. And so there's this long history. And we also see, even in the 18th century, we see examples also of resistance to racism that existed. And so I think it's important that we realize that the 60s to 80s is a culmination of not just decades, not just since the Windrush landed, not just a few decades of discrimination or even a few years, but rather a few centuries as well. In between the wars, lots and lots of Black and South Asian people fought in the world wars. And in between the wars, there was a lot of racial discrimination against them in the UK. There was the case of Charles Wotton, who was chased into the docks in Liverpool and left to die. And this happened time and time again. And so when we get to the 60s and 80s, people are really fed up, really, really fed up.
And another organisation actually that predates the post-war period is the IWA, the Indian Workers Association, which you begin with. And after the Nationality Act in 1948, that's really when you see larger numbers, a bigger presence of Black and South Asian people who came to help rebuild the country after the war. And the unions then, and again, it's one of those things that's hard to believe, they didn't protect really the rights of immigrant workers. And the IWA was really important in that. Just explain how they started and what they were and why they were so important for those early post-war migrants.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that the IWA, they actually started in the 1930s, and they started as so it's the Indian Workers Association, but they were kind of also primarily focused on welfare, and at that time in the 1930s focused on independence for India. And then they faded during the war, and then they came back in the 1950s all over the country. There were chapters everywhere. I focus on the IWA in Southall in West London, because that's where I grew up, and so I have a particular interest in the history of that town. But they had chapters all over the country, including a very big chapter, for example, in Birmingham. And they focused on welfare. They also focused on workers' rights, as you'd assume from their name. And they tried to organize people to join unions. They encouraged people to join unions, to become things like shop stewards, who would have some sort of leadership positions in factories and foundries. And they were encouraging people to organize for their rights. And this was really difficult because trade unions were often very, very hostile towards Black and brown people. A lot of them supported the very restrictive Immigrants Acts that came in the 60s and the 70s. There were claims that Black and brown people didn't fit in, that they were coming and taking jobs. A lot of the rhetoric we see then is actually very eerily similar to what we see today when we talk about immigration. And the IWA really helped to organize strikes. When there were strikes, they also helped to organize support for the strikers. So in a big strike that there was at a rubber factory in Southall, at the Wolf's factory, they organized with all the religious communities to collect money. And they also, the shopkeepers would keep a tab. They didn't charge people for food. And the whole community in that way rallied together with support and coordination from the IWA to support strike action, even when the unions were quite lukewarm with their support.
But one of the things they were quite instrumental over was busing. And again, it's one of those chapters that you can't quite believe happened. It happened for 2 decades. Is that right?
Yeah, 2 decades. And so I focus in the book, I mean, what they did in terms, the IWA did in terms of unions and workers' rights was phenomenal. But I actually focus on 2 other chapters around social justice issues, which they also took on. And one of those is busing. And busing was when Black and brown children, mostly brown children, were affected by busing, were, as it suggests, were bused from their area to other areas, to other towns and neighborhoods. So they were bused, they didn't go to local schools, they were bused to schools in other neighborhoods which had a majority white population. Now, the aim of this was to keep the schools in their area to only maximum 30% immigrant population. So any schools that had higher than 30% of the student body as immigrants, the rest were then bussed out. And they would go for miles. This often added up to 2 hours of travel time to their day. They couldn't get involved in the school community. Sometimes they'd have to actually leave early to go home because they were racially abused while they waited for the buses. They weren't part of those schools that they were bussed out to. And so the IWA in Southall in particular took this on. And this happened all over the country, also in Bradford and Wolverhampton, in Bristol. But again, I'm focusing on the experience of Southall. And the IWA Southall actually used race relations legislation in order to challenge this, and said, well, if you're only busing brown children, then this is discrimination. And they won that case based on that. So the Race Relations Board said to the local education authority, okay, well, you can either bus white children as well, or you can build more schools in the area. And so they decided to build more schools in the area. But whilst that was happening, it still went on for a few more years. So as you say, it was about 2 decades in many of the areas of the country. And they also took on the issue of virginity testing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I didn't know about that, and that was really shocking.
Yeah, I didn't know about that either. And it was one of those moments of looking around me and saying, well, why aren't we taught this? Why doesn't anyone know about this? And so this happened, well, for years. So brown women entering the country as fiancés could enter without having to apply for a visa from their home countries. And so women who were entering as fiancés were liable to undergo virginity testing at the airport as a way of essentially verifying that they were fiancés. So the logic being, well, if you're brown and unmarried, then you're going to be a virgin. And this was quite an open secret within the brown community. People knew about it for years, but they couldn't really challenge the government on it until they had evidence. And then one brave woman who we know as Mrs. Chaggar, or she became Mrs. Chaggar, she entered the country and she was in her 30s, and they thought, no brown woman in her 30s is unmarried. There's no way she's a fiancé. And she underwent invasive vaginal testing, and then she went to the IWA, and she had her slip of paper which said that I consent to this testing, and there was the first bit of evidence. And so that was then splashed on the pages of the front page of The Guardian. And finally, the government had to take notice. Obviously, the first thing they did was to deny it, and say it wasn't invasive. It was just a regular health check. And then they finally admitted it had happened in only 3 cases. But finally, we know that it was more. It was around 70 plus cases, and not just women entering the country, but also whilst they were applying for visas in the embassies in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and in India.
And do we know why? Why were they doing these tests? What were they looking for?
Well, they're testing for virginity, but beyond.
But why would they be testing for virginity? Oh, to verify whether people were coming in genuinely. Is that the purpose?
Yes. So the assumption was that if you were a fiance, if you were unmarried, then you'd be a virgin. And so they were thinking that a lot of people, because it was easier to come in as a fiance than come in as a wife, right. They thought actually these people must be wives trying to get in as fiancés. And so they just assumed that people were lying, trying to shaft the system, and that was their justification for doing this testing. Yeah. And then the IWA, took that not only nationally in the UK, but they also took that internationally. It was a big issue in India, and India also brought that to the UN, and we're trying to have the UK kind of sanctioned at the UN. And
the IWA, does it still operate now?
It does. It operates in Southall still. They have an office next to the Dominion Centre in Southall, which was a big cinema that they also had. They did cultural activities and had boxing and all sorts, and they still have their office next to that centre. And it operates also around the country. There are chapters still around the country.
You also focus on women, and a really iconic strike is the Grunwick Strike. And we have other strikes from that era that have been made and documented into documentaries and films. And funny enough, the Grunwick Strike just hasn't received that attention, and yet it was hugely dramatic, and so many thousands of people ended up on the streets to support the women. Just tell us about the strike and why that's such an important moment for you.
Yeah, when I was learning about the Grunwick Strike, and it was one of the first movements I actually learned about, and I was like, this is cinematic. I mean, this just needs to be made into a film. Yeah, the Grunwick Strike the Grunwick factory was a photo processing factory. And so if you ever sent off your rolls of film, like in kind of envelopes as a bonus print or triple print or things like that in the 90s, then they would likely go to a place like Grunwick. And they hired mostly brown women. They were in Northwest London, and they hired mostly brown women, especially women who had come from East Africa and had recently settled in the UK. And they exploited those workers. The manager of Grunwick was actually also himself brown, which also adds a layer of complication to the story. And they went on strike to protest these working conditions. I mean, pregnant women weren't allowed to go to the doctor. People weren't allowed to go to the toilet. There was compulsory overtime, constant threats of underperformance. And it was in the long, hot summer of 1976 when Jaya Desai, one of the workers, said, enough is enough. She was asked to do overtime and she said, no, I've got to go home, and she stormed out. And she managed to rally over 100 others to also do the same, who were sick of the working conditions. And so they went on strike. This is only about 20% of the factory workers, which wasn't quite enough to prompt the factory workers and the factory managers to change their minds. And so they went on a tour of the country. As well as picketing, they went on a tour and spoke to the nation's working class, factories, foundries, mills. And as you say, they rallied thousands of people down to the picket line. On the biggest day of striking, on the day of action, this was in 1977, 20,000 people came down to London, to this tiny corner of Northwest London. There were so many people on the streets that the walls outside houses fell down. They just couldn't withstand the pressure of all the people. Arthur Scargill and the miners came from Yorkshire. There were Labour MPs there. There were other celebrities. Everyone came down to support Grunwick. The dockers from East London, who just a few years previously had marched in support of Enoch Powell and his anti-immigration tirade of the Rivers of Blood speech, they were there. They were there to support these brown women. And it was this phenomenal, inspiring struggle to be recognized. And they actually had some union support, which was also unusual, but that waned very, very quickly. And so it was this group of mostly brown women who were pushing these efforts forward. And that's why it had to be included. And it's just the most incredible story.
But they didn't win, though, did they? I mean, they and that's the point. They had this extraordinary support, but they weren't allowed back. They didn't get what they were campaigning for.
They didn't. And it's a really interesting discussion around the legacy of something like Grunwick. One of the trade union leaders who was involved at the time, Jack Dromey, he said, you never lose a battle like Grunwick. It helped show people that brown women weren't to be messed with. It was one of the first times that white working class and black and brown working class had actually joined together in solidarity on that kind of scale. And it was one of the first times that the unions had actually taken brown women seriously. So there were lots of positive ripple effects that came out of it, even though they didn't achieve their real aim. And as one of the former workers pointed out, is that the workers who stayed at the factory, their lives improved. They got pay rises throughout the 2 years of the strike. They've got pensions. They had better rights actually because of the strikers.
When going through your book, one of the things that really struck me, and we forget that now, is how brutal racism was in the 70s. You talked about those kids being bused, but one of the most dangerous times of the day for school children was going to and from school, waiting for the bus. And you mentioned 2 murders of Altab and Gurdip Singh Chaggar, which anyone living in the 70s would remember, certainly if they were of South Asian origin. And it was a really, really dangerous time. Just tell us about those deaths, because they were awful, but they also were a really important moment, a turning point, in fact, because that generation just said, we're not putting up with this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing you mentioned at the end is the generation. And so I'll just start with that. So by the late 70s, you started to have the first people were coming of age. Those who'd been born in the UK were coming of age. So previously, you'd had people who had migrated to the UK, they'd settled, they'd had children, and they were becoming teenagers and adults in the late 70s, a lot of them. And so while previously the generation before them, their parents had been kind of in survival mode almost, this new generation said, no, that's still not good enough. We don't want to just survive. We're not going back anywhere. This is where we live. This is our home. This is all we know in the UK. And so we need to be accepted here. We need to say that enough is enough. And so in 1976, 18-year-old Gurdip Singh Chaggar was murdered in Southall whilst he was out on a Friday night with his friends. And this was dismissed by the police. They refused to call it racism. The Indian Workers Association in Southall called for calm and for a meeting to discuss some sort of very calm action, to write to the police, to talk to them, to have kind of a community engagement. And the young generation said, no, that's not enough. Someone has been murdered. One of us has been murdered in cold blood on the streets, and we're going to do something about it now. And so they marched down to the police station and demanded action, demanded that this case be taken seriously. One of the police officers who was guarding the crime scene had remarked when someone walked by, oh, it was just an Asian. It was just an Asian that was killed. And so it was against that kind of attitude that the young generation were rallying. And they created the Asian youth movements. So that was Gurdip Singh Chaggar was murdered on the Friday. On the Saturday and Sunday, they had all these actions. And by Monday, the Asian youth movement in Southall was formed. They decided to protect their streets, to protect their community, and to not wait for the older generation, but to take things into their own hands. And then 2 years later, we see a similar thing happening in the east of London. So this is when Altab Ali, who was a young Bengali man who was just walking on his way home, getting ready to vote in the local elections that were happening, and he was also stabbed and murdered. And we know that these were racial attacks because they had their money on them. There's no evidence of a robbery. This was racially motivated, and that his death triggered what we call the Battle of Brick Lane in the East End of London, where the Bengali community said, yeah, enough is enough. Altab Ali was only one in a string of murders that had happened. And they decided to take to the streets to protect it against the far-right group, the National Front, who would roam the streets and beat people up, quite simply. They decided to protect the streets, and they also decided to try and prompt the police into some sort of action because the police were not protecting them. And so thousands of them all across that summer for months and months would take to the streets every Sunday when the National Front would appear to sell their newspaper on the corner of Brick Lane. they would be there first. Bengalis would have camped out overnight so the National Front couldn't set up their stalls. And so we see this incredible show of community organizing taking place amongst the younger generation, and that happened all over the country, up in Bradford, in Leicester, in Manchester, in Sheffield, everywhere. And they would also support each other, and they would travel on coaches when they knew there was going to be a big event, and they would support each other at those.
And it's really important to kind of give that geographical dimension, because around that time in the late 70s, it was happening across the country. It's Asian youth movements, but it was also part of the kind of anti-racist movements. And sometimes these were street battles, not just in Brick Lane or on Southall. It was in Lewisham, it was in Bradford. And it really was, as you say, Black and South Asians fighting together, but it was also the white community as well. And I think that's important to say, that they were part of that anti-racist movement. And we see that awfully with the death of Blair Peach in 1979, don't we? So just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to highlight that there was a lot of support from white people throughout this time. We also see groups like the Anti-Nazi League, who would always be at these events as well. And in 1979, so 3 years after the murder of Gurdip Singh Chaggar, and 3 years of the youth movement trying to protect the community, and then they learn that the National Front has decided to come to Southall to hold an election meeting. Now, Southall is a majority brown population. They do not have much National Front support, and they saw this as a deliberately provocative meeting to be held in the Southall Town Hall, in the heart of the town. And so the community got together and were thinking about what to do. The Indian Workers Association, they wanted a sit-down protest, and the Asian youth movements weren't happy with that kind of action. Anyway, so everyone gathered on the day of the meeting, and they asked for all businesses to shut down from 1 p.m. And most of them did, even the big factories around the town, such as the Walls factory. They had so many workers leaving halfway through the day, they also had to close down. And thousands of people gathered to try and prevent the National Front from entering the town hall. Now, the police were also out in major force that day, because they also knew that people were coming from out of town or from different parts of London. And this included Blair Peach, who was a teacher, and he came from East London. He was originally from New Zealand. And he was pursued, and he was smacked on the head, and he died. Basically he was murdered. And this was covered up by the police. This was covered up for years. There was a massive inquiry that was never made public until a few years ago. And so even though we know that it was one of 4 police officers that killed him, they've never been brought to justice. And this we see time and time again also throughout the period, that there's a lot of leeway for the police and their actions.
You end the book in 1981, which was another really turbulent year. The New Cross fire, but also riots across the country. Do you see that as a huge turning point?
Yeah, I ended it in 1981 with actually what I call the uprisings versus riots, and that's a big, I think, point of contention around like language that we use to describe it. And I ended it there because it was a turning point. It was a turning point from this grassroots action, this solidarity that we see between Black and brown communities. It was a turning point to more actions from the state trying to control anti-racist movements and kind of dampen the radical spirits that they saw happening. And so in 1981, there were uprisings that took place in 29 towns and cities across the country, that summer people said enough was enough, and they were fighting against the state and the police, and high unemployment, or as they've been described, they weren't the unemployed, they were the never employed. And so this was their last chance, their last option to speak up, because there were no Black or brown MPs. They couldn't go that way. They weren't represented anywhere. They were shunned by the mainstream politics, and so they had to take to the streets. There was nothing else to do at that point.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we talked at the start about Black being a term that was South Asian, and Black, it was a political term. But around this time, around 1981, we see this kind of fragmentation between the Black and South Asian community, but also very much within those groups as well. Did that make the anti-racist cause harder to fight, or is that, in some ways, is it a sign of success that some of what they'd fought for had been achieved, do you think?
So I think this was always a point of contention throughout those decades, in terms of how much interaction to have with the state. To do movements accept state funds? Do movements work with state organized groups? I deliberately don't really focus on state organized initiatives in this time, and focus more on the grassroots. But there was always in the background state organized initiatives to combat racism. And so we see this fragmentation. We see people start joining mainstream political parties, for finally being accepted. There were Black sections in the Labour Party. There were lots of liaison positions created and lots of community relations officers that sprung up. And so I think some people definitely saw this as a success, like finally having access to the state machine and state power and everything that comes with that, and there was just lots and lots of funding that was around. So many organizations who had not previously accepted funding decided to do so, such as some of the Black women's groups, like the Organization for Women of Asian and African Descent. They started to accept funding. And that came with a lot of boxes to tick, a lot of bureaucracy. And that also came with having to define yourself and your needs. So previously you could be a group, a very collaborative group of disparate people from disparate backgrounds, but all rallying around a particular cause. Suddenly you had to distinguish yourself based on your culture and your very individual religion or community. And this fragmentation we still see today. And me personally, I don't see that as a success, but I think some people did see it as a success, in that, okay, finally we are getting access to our piece of the pie.
Where do you think we are now in terms of the movements towards anti-racism? I mean, they're different, but where are we in that kind of long struggle?
I think we are finally realizing we've been doing a lot of individual action. There's been a lot of emphasis on individuality and signing petitions and posting things on social media. But I think a lot of us have been scratching our heads and realizing, well, why isn't this changing anything? And we also now have more Black and brown people in positions of power than we ever have before. So why isn't that changing anything? And I think a lot of us are realizing that, oh, actually, it's collective action that leads to change. I think we really saw this in 2020 with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think we also see it now more generally with a lot of the strikes that are taking place in the UK. I think people are coming to realize that this focus on individuality isn't necessarily going to take us where we want to be. And so I think a lot of people are organizing again. So I think we're kind of coming full circle. And I think I've been writing this for 3 years. And in that time, I've seen I've seen a real increase in interest in learning about these movements, because people also want to learn from the past and see what we've done before, and be inspired by that and take lessons from that as they organize today.
You mentioned in the book that doing this research over the last couple of years has changed you in understanding this history and the fight before, but also it's changed the way that you feel about your position in Britain. Just explain that.
Yeah, and this might sound a bit grim, but it ends on a high note. But yeah, I think I've realized that being a brown British citizen, a lot of people don't see me as a true Brit. I was born and raised. That's all I know. Just like the teenagers in the 70s. But my rights aren't necessarily the same as they are for white British citizens, and that has made me feel quite despondent at times. But I also, learning about these movements has made me realize that, oh, there's a lot of reason to feel hopeful, that I have the tools for change, that they've been there all along, that there's a long history of people like me not just being victimized, but having agency and doing things and being active, and that option is also there for me. And I think, yeah, that has made me, it's made me more hopeful, I think, overall, as well as the pit of despondency I fell into at the beginning.
I think that's a good place to end, Preeti Dhillon. Thank you very much. And Preeti's book, The Shoulders We Stand On, you've got the better copy, you've got the real copy, is out on September the 14th, and I highly recommend it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavita.